I want to, okay.
Bonjour. Yeah, shall I begin, sir?
We can begin. There are enough number of people now.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And they are joining us. They will be joining us by the time we finish introduction. I think they'll all join.
Okay.
Bonjour, madame et messieurs. Je m'appelle Ariba Hassanat Mausam. You must all be wondering why I am beginning today's event with French introduction. It is because we have with us our esteemed speaker who is proficient in French language. He is someone who was my first supervisor during my master's at the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. What he taught me has stayed with me even today. I believe that I am one of the lucky people who had the chance to study in his last batch at that campus, a man of many talents and accomplishments. He is the one who told us that we can never compare an apple and an orange. And I think it is one of the most important learning that any researcher should have. He always also told us that we should write like a reader knows nothing and each line should flow into another. I think these are some of the things that I learned from him and have helped me in writing my research papers, and I hope they do in while you write yours too. He is with us today at our 8th e-lecture by the Association of Indian Research Scholars, or as we like to call it, AS. Bienvenue tout le monde. Welcome everyone. We are back once again with a topic and a speaker who seems to be quite popular, as we have received around 222 registrations. We are glad that you all have joined us for an in-depth analysis and insights by Professor Rajan Harshe, who was the founder and former Vice Chancellor of Central University of Allahabad. He is an institution builder who once told me that it is institutions that we need to build for progress and development of our country. He loves research and wants to build research institutions so that he leaves behind a legacy of researchers. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I am Ariba Ahmed Mausam, Senior Research Scholar at the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. I would now like to request one of our executive members, Ivan, PhD Research Scholar at the Department of English, University of Hyderabad, to walk us through the inception of Association of Indian Research Scholars. Over to you, Ivan.
Thanks, Ariba. All right. So I'm going to be reading the introduction to the Association of Indian Research Scholars, also known as AIRS. Now, this association is the brainchild of Ariba Ahsanat, the president of this association. It was created to bring together like-minded, intellectually inclined, and enthusiastic research scholars of our generation, and to collectively increase our knowledge base while also interacting with the best minds in the world. To this end, we have garnered the support of some of the best in their field, including Professor Mohammad Mausam Ali, Professor and former HOD, Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Emerita, Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru, Professor Alfredo Toro Hardy, retired Venezuelan diplomat, scholar, professor, and public intellectual, Dr. Aparna Devare, Assistant Professor at the University of Hyderabad, Professor Rajan Harshe, Professor of Political Science and the former Vice Chancellor of Allahabad Central University, and many scholars from across the world, including Nuno Rodriguez, Director, Quixote Global from Madrid, Spain, Paul Szymanski from Space Strategy Center, Carnegie Mellon University, New Mexico, USA. The aim of an association like AIRS is to not only provide a platform for young scholars to connect with experts, but also to have intellectually stimulating and interactive sessions with them. In order to make this happen, we aim to host webinars, e-lectures, seminars, talks, book discussions, and distinguished lectures. In the future, we also intend to expand towards doing conferences, seminars, symposiums, and book discussion panels. Through these mediums, AIRS intends to promote a seamless and harmonious interaction and engagement between the social sciences and humanities communities in the country. It also aspires to bring together people to hold discussions, debates, and conversations on theory, research methodology, research ethics, research practices, and methods to expand the research community and to bring everyone within one ambit. The future of AIRS holds dynamic experiences. We intend to bring the Indian community closer to the international community, not only through lectures and seminars, but also through publication. AIRS intends to focus on the most relevant issues in the world and the various pressing scenarios on the national and international scene. Following AIRS will help you stay on the top of not only current affairs and get an in-depth analysis of burning topics, but it will also give you the opportunity to expand your knowledge base through the diversity of our events. We would like to mention that we have 4 publication opportunities. Our president has been appointed as a reviewer for Millennium Journal of Humanities and Social Sciences. We have also been approached by DSA or Defense Security Alert Team asking for articles for their magazine. We would like our viewers to take a look at the links which we would be providing on our various WhatsApp and Telegram groups and to do the needful. Yet another publishing opportunity has been offered to AIRS in the form of the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, which engages with an array of topics from defense policy to international relations. And finally, Global Dialogue Review, an internationally circulated foreign policy journal from India, has also opened an entry for articles through AIRS. You can submit our papers to the official mail, which is ariba.muazzam@airsscholars on Microsoft.com. The mail will be on our chat box for accuracy. You can follow AIRS on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, Telegram. You can also follow our site, airs.org.in. And with that, we come to the end of the introduction. Thank you, and over to you, Ariba.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ivan, for that succinct introduction of AIRS. Now let me introduce our eminent speaker. Professor Rajan Harshe sir was the founder and first Vice Chancellor of the University of Allahabad after it regained the central status. He was also a full-time visiting professor in the Department of International Relations, South Asian University, New Delhi. He is also the president of the prestigious G.B. Pant Social Science Institute of Allahabad since May 2014. Before shifting over to South Asian University, he was the professor in the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. Dr. Harshe sir is an eminent social scientist and a leading scholar of international relations studies in India. A PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, he did part of his doctoral work at the Fondation Nationale des Sciences Politiques of Paris on a French government fellowship. He was a Fulbright scholar at the Columbia University, New York, where he did his postdoctoral research. He was also Linné Palm Fellow at the Uppsala University, Sweden in November 2003. As part of the Indian delegation of vice chancellors, he visited the US on International Visitors Leadership Program in September 2007. Professor Harshe has traveled quite widely on important assignments as member and leader of national delegations and as visiting scholar in several countries, including USA, Netherlands, Russia, Sweden, Finland, Turkey, Iran, Sudan, Algeria, Western Sahara, Thailand, the Republic of South Africa, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Nepal, and many more. He was also a member of Indo-Russian Joint Commission for Cooperation in Social Sciences during the years 1997 to 2003. Besides, he was also the president of African Studies Association of India, 2005 to 2011. He was also the sectional president of Indian National Congress for the year 2009 to 2010. He is also the editor-in-chief of Africa Review. He has received several honors, including the Honorary Colonel Ferguson Gaurav Award and MIT Academic Excellence Award in 2008. Professor Harshe is an active scholar with impressive and diverse range of publications covering development-related issues in areas such as South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Western Europe, as also theories of international relations, especially those related to imperialism and globalization. Professor Harshe's initial forays were in African and international relations. His writings on neocolonialism and underdevelopment were pathfinding. He was also the Indian scholar to have published a pioneering study on the French Africa, entitled Pervasive Entente France and Ivory Coast in African Affairs. His book, entitled 20th Century Imperialism, shifting contours and changing conceptions from 1997 has already earned him international recognition. It is being used as important reading in several courses in social sciences in India and abroad. His edited work entitled Interpreting Globalization, Perspectives in International Relations represents a commendable collective endeavor with the contributions from well-known Indian and Russian social scientists. Apart from publishing a diverse range of articles on Indian foreign policy, Professor Hershey has co-edited many anthologies and edited volumes. His latest book is entitled Reflections on Nation Building, A Gypsy in a World of Ideas, 2011. He has to his credit over 80 articles in prestigious anthologies and academic journals. Professor Hersey has given several lectures and keynote addresses. He has also chaired many sessions in prestigious national and international seminars. In addition to a long administrative experience, he has also had the privilege of functioning as an expert search committee member for Vice Chancellorship, Vice Chairman, University Grants Commission of India, member Board of Governors of IIT Kanpur, member of Academic and Executive Councils of different universities, consultant and resource person in several prestigious academic institutions. In fact, he has also been associated in different capacities with the Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Human Resource Development, Government of India, the World Bank, Planning Commission of India, the National Knowledge Commission, the Ford Foundation, Fulbright Foundation, the European Commission, the UGC, the Indian Council of Social Science Research, and the National Assessment and Accreditation Council. So as you can see, he has such a remarkable career in institution building and as a scholar. Now invite Professor Hershey sir to take the floor. Over to you, Professor Hershey.
Good morning to all my students, friends who are in India, and those who are attending from United States. Good evening. It's a great occasion, and one of my former students, Ariba, has been very kind to arrange my meeting virtually with so many of you. She gave a very long introduction. I would only like to say that I hope I live up to it. My latest book has been Africa in World Affairs, Politics of Imperialism, Cold War and Globalization. That came out in 2019. So I've forgotten all the past books, including this. Something more has to happen now. So many of my friends have come from different parts of the country that I am really overwhelmed. Some of you are natural scientists. And naturally, I would like to see that you get involved in what I am saying, and I will simplify what I am saying so that you become part of our debates. When the organizers asked me to speak, I thought I will talk on a broad theme like globalization and the nation state. What could be the components of this lecture? How would I evolve it? I'll just give you a brief idea first as to how I'm going to proceed, so that you also keep track of me and you also control me from deviating or talking nonsense. Ariba is smiling. You know, many times I tell my students that whatever does not make sense to you in the class is nonsense. So you stand up in the class and say, I'm talking nonsense, I'll be humbled. So anyway, the course of lecture, I was thinking, you know, I'm going to discuss current phase of globalization. I am aware of the historical possibilities and history of globalization. People like my friends Dayan Chanda have related it to birth of man. Some people related to movement of ideas by Plato, Aristotle, from here to Chanakya's ideas of Shukra Niti, whatever. I am concerned about current Cold War phase, and I will give you the justification for it in a moment. So I am going to talk about post-Cold War phase, post-1991 phase, and I will tell you why. That will be first, that this is the phase. The second area will be, I will try to give you salient features of globalization but pause a little bit and try to connect globalization and capitalism. There is intertwined relationship between globalization and modern capitalism. How does one understand it? I will not be reductionist. I will not reduce globalization to capitalism, but I will tell you how many ways capitalism is complex and how difficult it is to understand the reality and how it is connected to globalization. Then I will talk about nation state, defining nation, defining state, how they are functioning, how they are going through existential strains from above and below. Then I will talk about imperialism, globalization and nation states, and then work out whether nation state is an essential agency which is limiting process of globalization or promoting it. It has both and will work out both. Let's see how it works. So this is the brief area around which I will talk. Let me begin then. The first thing that I feel, to my mind, is disintegration of the Soviet Union was a very important event in contemporary world politics. You will say why. Now, in 1917, Russia became communist, and we were given a dream that we'll have a system which defeats capitalism in the area of consumption, production, exchange, consumption, production, exchange, and also as in terms of equality. They wanted to kind of establish equal society somewhere, equality of opportunities. So it was a utopia, and world fell for it. Russia kind of became an alternative to modern capitalism. And 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated. And that is a very important departing point for me personally, because I'm going to argue that capitalism doesn't have a formidable alternative today, but that's a later thing. Coming down to then, what is globalization? What does it mean? We use this term always, but we don't know what it is. I will also not define it, but say a few things. First, that globalization is a complex, multifaceted, varying social processes. Globalization involves multifaceted, complex, and varying social processes. And broadly, we describe them as globalization after Cold War, particularly after Cold War ended. In terse terms, if you think of globalization, then somewhere we are imagining world as a single unit, where time and space are compressed. World as a single unit, where time and space are compressed, and we are imagining world as one, as a global village. That is one way of looking at globalization. I would like to say that global and local also are connected, and I'll come to that later. I would also like to say that this entire process is consistently stimulated by international communication revolution, international communication technologies, and today we are kind of living in a world where China and America are fighting for technological hegemony in IT world. And again, nation states, how it comes to being, I'll kind of get back to it. It has been wonderfully brought out recently by Samir Saran and Shashi Tharoor's book on world disorder. Then quickly, as I say, that globalization entails free flow of capital, free flow of goods, free flow of knowledge, free flow of ideas, free flow of technology, free flow of finances, free flow of information, free flow of drugs. I would say free flow of even terror and diseases. Globalization is putting you in a borderless world where things are supposed to flow freely. That means globalization has already, to my international relations students, I would say, it has widened the arena of conflict and cooperation. There is a much wider arena where you can begin cooperation or cooperative ventures, and there is also a wider area where local can become global if conflict gets exacerbated, it gets exposed. But why this idea came up? I think globalization began to kind of become a reality because somewhere nation state felt short of solving problems which are global. For example, there is environmental degradation, ecological destruction, climate change, nuclear proliferation, violation of human rights, violation of child rights, rise of multinational terrorist organizations. How does one nation state handle all this? It is only coalition of nation states, it's only world community, it's only form of world government that can handle it. And that's where the need of globalization has been felt. And that's why we are striking transnational alliances, transnational coalitions to fight climate change, to fight terror. And that's how I put globalization. Again, to strike transnational alliances also, nation state is a premier important member when such alliances are struck. I would also like to say that, in this borderless world, are the nation states adapting themselves? We'll try to see. And I'll show it with reference to Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Africa, Asia, so that you have panorama and panoramic view. Point then is that globalization has brought somewhere, my left friends will not like it, but I'll put it slightly forthrightly, that globalization and fall of the Soviet Union has somewhere brought erstwhile socialist model into disrepute. Somewhere it has gone into disrepute, not that the ideas are irrelevant, but somewhere, even if you look at Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Eastern Europe, the Stalinist regimes were overthrown. Central Asia, so many new ethnic nationalities came up, and 5 commonwealths of independent states came up after Russia fell. I would like to say that there are left-leaning regimes which came in Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, but still somewhere socialist ideas have got a beating. And I would go even further and state that today China talks of market socialism. They talk of socialism with Chinese characteristics. But one very interesting thing is, and a lot of debate has been there in political science, I'm sure about this, which you know, China is building capitalism, and it's a state-directed capitalism. It's a very new way of building capitalism which China is achieving. There are multinational firms of China. There's a huge public sector of Chinese Republic, and they are kind of state is directing capitalism, and they are not given up the idea of fighting with United States and also extending the dominance in the world. So simple thing then is my major point would be that after the fall of Soviet Union, capitalism has not merely emerged as a major mode of production, but as a world system. I am not saying it. Immanuel Wallerstein has understood and analyzed it since 16th century. I am also not interested in defining capitalism, but I will try to describe some of its features so that you understand what I mean by capitalism. First important feature is means of production are in the privately owned or in corporate hands. That is first important feature. The second important feature in my view is that you have conflictual as well as cooperative relationship between wage labor and capital. Conflictual as well as cooperative relationship between wage labor and capital. Third, that there is socialization of production. Production process gets socialized all the time, but there is appropriation of profit which is private. Socialization of production, appropriation of profit is private. And last, it always generates surplus, and the surplus gets accumulated on the world scale. I think these are some of the features of modern capitalism, and we are living in those times. You have transnational banks, you have transnational firms, transnational mobile capital, transnational social classes. They are somewhere running this, and on the functional cooperation between different countries, we are kind of, capitalism is functioning. I would also like to mention here that because of the rise of capitalism, because of the rise of globalization as a phenomenon, different countries have found a new way of responding to globalization. So new regional organizations have also come up. American Free Trade Agreement between American continent and Mexico and Canada. Now, Mexico kind of violated environmental standards. Still, America inducted Mexico in their organization because they didn't want any competition from Germany and Japan. Your Shanghai Cooperation Organization, your very seasoned organization like European Union, it worked very well for some time till Brexit took place in 2016 and Britain withdrew. You have Southeast Asian Nation Association, ASEAN, another important organization in East Asia, and that entire Indo-Pacific region is becoming important today. Your South African Development Community in Southern Africa, your Economic Community of West Africa in West Africa, your Persian Gulf countries and their association. So regionalization and regionalism is a new response to globalization, including South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, where I taught. Unfortunately, this is the association which is not functioning so well because of India and Pakistan are at loggerheads. I would like to mention here that capitalism always has known crisis, how to handle them, and got over it. A slightly more nuanced argument I would like to make that since 16th century capitalism has gone on as a system, 19th century we had seen laissez-faire capitalism, post 30s and 40s we saw welfare capitalism and Keynes. And capitalism is a complex system which has a capacity to create, destroy and recreate itself. And that's something very remarkable which many of us do not catch. Capitalists can accommodate the agenda of some of the most radical opponents. Like World Bank, for example, is an organization dominated by the capitalist countries, but they began to talk of human rights, social exclusion, etc., which any radicals would like to talk. Furthermore, in France, for example, when Mitterrand was president, the 4 communist ministers and socialist president and communist ministers were running French capitalism. So when communists can work and run capitalism. Another thing that I would like to say is the nuanced part, that capitalism has different forms of social base. In Europe, it was class that stimulated it, it was a catalyst. In Japan, it was community. In South Africa, apartheid South Africa, it was race. In Southeast Asian countries, it's again community somewhere. And India, family-based capitalist. It can also assume many forms of government. Don't think that only liberals are capitalists, Britain and France and America. You have authoritarian regimes which are capitalist. Nazi Germany was capitalist. South Africa has been capitalist, which is apartheid. So it can assume different forms. It has also different social base, but as a system it has worked. Another important feature is that globalization and capitalism are intertwined, and capitalism is agent of globalization somewhere, or globalization is agent of capitalism, both works. And somewhere what is happening is the drawbacks of capitalism, like social inequalities, uneven and combined development, they are reflecting in the process of globalization where you have inequalities between citizens, between regions, between nations, and between continents. So this is inevitable part of uneven development which capitalism carries. Globalization has also brought into being more number of transnational regimes. Now, transnational regime is one where different states come and they sign an agreement and try to live with it. For example, World Trade Organization is a transnational regime. World Bank is a transnational regime. IMF is a transnational regime. Or when captains of industry and statesmen gather in World Economic Forum, they're trying to work out a transnational regime. And what happens is then all these transnational regimes go on pressurizing the nation state from above. Because somewhere when regional organizations like EU or ASEAN are formed, or somewhere you become part of transnational regime, nation state somewhere loses ingredients of its sovereignty to protect itself differently. So nation state is an essential element to constitute transnational regime, regional organization, but it also, its powers are curbed because transnational regime function. I would also like to move further and state that we have also seen emergence of international civil society, which was, which is there. And, many manifestations of it are there. For example, when Seattle conference took place of WTO, many NGOs wanted to be represented. And then ultimately, in Seattle, NGOs struck. They had agitation actually, 5,000 NGOs agitated. I was surprised because I can tell you, as a Vice Chancellor of Allahabad University, I handled much bigger agitation than what happened in Seattle. But Americans could not handle the agitation, and eventually NGOs got into the negotiating table also. They represented international civil society in subsequent times. So the point is, we have international civil society also. And last part which I want to mention here is that all this is going on, and because there are large firms, intra-industry trade has also risen much more than before, more than international trade. Intra-industry trade is important today. And finally, what has happened under globalization is, see, for example, rise of multinational terrorist organizations. I think Al-Qaeda emerged as a very important terrorist organization with almost 90 branches across the world. Osama bin Laden began humbly with American support to oust Russians from Afghanistan, but they grew. And then they have also association Boko Haram in West Africa, Al-Shabaab in East Africa, Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba of Pakistan. So it's a radicalized Islam, and their terrorism is today a multinational reality. And Osama bin Laden is a phenomenon which you see because of globalization. I would also say that Bill Gates also is a phenomenon which globalization has thrown. So there are two sides of the same coin, Bill Gates and Osama bin Laden. You have also earlier what we used to think was that they are only transnational organizations without the support of the state. But they constituted Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So they were state, terrorists became state, and they were gathering revenue, they're kind of oppressing women, and they functioned for some time. Today they are wiped out, so we think. But they are erupting in different forms all the time in different parts of the world. And we can't say that they are over. So terrorism is a phenomenon we have to live with, and this is what globalization has given you. Its character is also international. So when you look at world politics today, I would consider that the United States is a sole superpower, sole military superpower. Nobody has military capacity of the United States, but otherwise China is competing with it under globalization. Germany, with a leading role in European Union, is competing with. Japan is there slightly behind. You have also BRICS countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, Russia. They are together, 5 big countries, and they are also important players. And somewhere there is a kind of, you have to look at new multilateralism to solve world problems. Multilateralism to solve world problems. Otherwise it is not easy. And then you have to kind of, earlier what happens is, Britain was hegemonic power in 19th century. United States was hegemonic power in 20th century after Second World War. Hegemonic means sheerly dominant. But today, no idea has any hegemony, or liberalism also doesn't have hegemony. And still, we require a force to regulate relations between nations, between societies, to build consensus, to have a kind of democratic and peaceful exchanges. And that is missing, although we talk of multilateralism. Entire Asia-Pacific area is also emerging very fast. Now, this is what I have to say about globalization and capitalism. I would add one footnote to it. I think President Donald Trump was completely against the process of globalization, and what he did was something else. He opposed migrants, he raised white supremacist ideas and also attacked the blacks. He didn't think of world as America used to think earlier. He talked of America first. So if you see Samuel Huntington's book, Who Are We? But the word they say America became America because there so many ethnic groups came from different parts of the world and West began to settle there. But Donald Trump actually became protectionist. He also began to build walls, and he began to retreat from his world role. They walked out of Paris Climate Agreement, they walked out of Iran deal, nuclear deal. They walked out of Trans-Pacific Partnership. So America began to kind of withdraw, shrink, and that is what happened during Trump's time. In fact, anti-globalization forces were encouraged by Trump himself. And I recall the New York Times title, Jobs are Bangalore. Ram and Anuradha are from Bangalore. Job getting Bangalore means somewhere Indians are getting the job from United States. And how will they tolerate it? Jobs cannot be Bangalore. Why should Indians work and give their labor at a cheaper price and Americans should be unemployed? So Donald Trump brought this, and you have to bear in mind. I think I have spoken enough about globalization, its connection with capitalism. I'll turn to nation state. I would first like to say here that we have to separate the two. There is something like state and there is something like nation. State is a juridical entity, it's legal. Any entity which has population, territory, sovereignty and government constitutes state. Marxist-Leninist people believed that state is an irreconcilable product of class antagonisms. Irreconcilable product of class antagonism. And Gramscians believed, Gramsci was an Italian thinker, philosopher, that the state is a kind of instrument in instrument in the hands of dominant classes or coalition of classes. But simple thing that you say about state is that state is the only entity, what Max Weber said, with legitimate physical force. It has a legitimate physical force. It may have illegitimate physical force also. Military dictators are not legitimate, they are not elected, they have no consent. But there can be illegitimate physical force also. So the defining feature of any state is its coercive power and extractive power. It can levy taxes and it can punish because it has organized violence in its hand. So state is juridical, essentially. But I would say nation is a psychocultural entity. Psychocultural. You feel a nation, otherwise you don't feel a nation. Nation sometimes can be imagined community. You imagine a nation, you feel a nation. Like an entire kind of, Savarkar's writing on Hindutva, he imagined what India is, and that was his book. Jawaharlal Nehru, The Discovery of India. He imagined India that was somewhere people, different communities were staying together with peace, and he socially constructed India on a geographical map of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh of the times. So nations are imagined, nations are cultural, they are socio-cultural. One nation, one state is not a reality every time. Japan perhaps comes closest to it. Otherwise, what happens is there are states trying to become nations, like many African states are trying to become nations. There are many ethnic groups that are becoming nations, trying to become national integration. And there are nations in search of state. Like Tamilians in Sri Lanka felt that they are a nation itself, so they wanted a separation from Sri Lanka. Basque separatists in Spain, Irish people in Britain, or Kurdish people of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, they want to establish Kurdistan because they feel they are a nation and they want to get out and form a nation. Quebec ones in Canada. So it is in first world as well as third world. As far as Africa is concerned, I will give you several examples where nations are trying to search a state for themselves. But rarely are they able to break out. There is also one thing that you have to be sensitive to, that for example, Bengal constitutes nationality, West Bengal and East Bengal. But one nation called Bengal is divided into two states, India and Bangladesh. Pakistan, Punjabis and Punjabis were divided into two states. There can be multinational states like Switzerland. There can be multinational states like former Soviet Union or today's Russia also. And whether India is multinational state or not is a debatable issue. But people conceive of it as multinational state because Maharashtra, whatever you talk of Bengal, they are not states, but that's a nationality. That's what is argued by Oman and others. While I would like to say that some people like Ravindra Kumar have argued that India is a civilization state. So these are all debates we have to understand. But to break out of a state and form a new state is a difficult task. And it has happened rarely after Cold War. Namibia became free birth referendum out from South Africa. Eritrea became free from Ethiopia, and recently Sudan became free from South Sudan became free from Sudan. So this has happened too. And I would like to say that whatever that nation state as an animal may be, I will make two of my comments. I personally find a personal view that nation and state both are violent enterprises. You are building walls, you are violent. Without violence, no nation can be built. And state involves violence alone, nation is also violent. This is what I feel. Sometime later, I will kind of tell you how I have read Gulzar and his writings and felt about partition. But this is not the time. I would like to then say that I will kind of go on to kind of working out how you can see nation states in different parts of the world. My first illustration will be West Europe and Europe at large. How integration and fragmentation, two ideas, two notions have consistently coexisted in Europe, I'll just tell you. I should kind of talk about Pierre Hassler, my professor, and one of his absolutely brilliant articles. Pierre Hassler's title itself suggests that article, Nation State, Obsolete or Obstinate. Obsolete or obstinate. When you look at Western Europe, France, Germany, Britain, they integrated themselves so fast. They established a customs union. European Economic Community was thriving. It became European Community. It became European Union. The transnational banks working closely, functional cooperation was worked out, everything was normal, and you felt as if it is obsolete. There will be no nation state. But that is momentary. Europeans were also trying to impose some kind of laws, like, they're talking about human rights for all. And when the fascist party in Austria was elected, they wanted to ban Austria and his regime. That means somewhere there's something like deterritorialization of nation. That's what we thought. But it is not exactly true. It is not exactly true. But why it is not true? Look, somewhere, kind of France, for instance, that they are European, at the same time they're French, and they are unable to handle their multicultural society. France has 5 million Muslims, and they have not been able to integrate themselves in France. So the one nation, one state, Muslims kind of feel out of place because they are not getting sufficient respect. France is not able to convince them about secularism. So tensions are there always. And that's why whatever you see, that something is becoming obsolete, certainly roots, identity, that starts playing up, and people use that identity, and fights begin within a nation. So although European countries and West European countries went ahead, they are not entirely stable. And that is what I want to say. So they were cosmopolitan, but not entirely stable. I would like to say here that, although they tried to kind of put sanctions against Austrian Haider, his regime, in Freedom Party, they also tried to manage 2008 recession well, European countries. Still, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, they were not able to be part of European Union well. So within European Union, there were tensions after East European countries joined them. Within each country, there were tensions, and any time they could assert their nationality. France has asserted it. Germany has begun to assert it. They have Nazi party today. Netherlands are asserting it. So somewhere nationalism again comes back, although you're part of European Union. And if you look at East European countries, then they were located on the tri-junction of empires. Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when Russia fell, so many Eastern nationalities came up, and nationalism became the cry. They wanted to assert themselves on the basis of nationality. Remember Czechoslovakia, how Russia attacked it, Hungary, they attacked it. So that national identity, East Europe is very strong. So East Europe is strong national identity. West Europe is slightly weaker identity. And I would say, although there is European Union of 27 or 28 nations, somewhere the subterranean forces of identity politics of nation, they continue. So European Union regulates behavior among nations and state. Now, nation states also try to influence the way European Union will function. I would also like to say that Britain at one stage felt so ill at ease with Europe, ill at ease with the idea of Euro, that Brexit took place, they walked out of Europe. So it's not necessary that any Europe regional organization also will stand. The basic component is nation state, and nation state doesn't cooperate, organization integrate. And that's the role nation states still have in politics. I would go to Africa, deliberately taking examples which are much in contrast. Take, for example, Africa always had a perennial problem between how to establish nations because colonial powers left them states. They had coercive and extractive powers, but nationality was not there. They could not construct a nation out of that. So what happened was they had to use state to build a nation. State strengthening nation. Now I have one point to make. You are aware of many leaders from Africa. Julius Nyerere was a teacher leader. He gave so many lectures. He talked of Ujamaa, the extended family, to bring Tanzanian nationalism. You have Nkrumah, who worked in the civil rights in Ghana. You have Nelson Mandela, who talked of rainbow coalitions, and he brought all the races together. So they are teacher leaders who try to build a nation, and there is a state strengthening nationalism. A state works to build a nation. I did not tell this to you because in India, Nehru government used the state to build a nation. All integration of nation, unity in diversity, rainbow coalitions. They were all teacher leaders. Nasir, Nehru, Sukarno in Asia, or of course, Nasir was in North Africa, but in Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, teacher leaders were playing a great role in building of a nation. And state was used to build a nation. But you have also state subverting nationalism. That some kind of group subverts the state nationalism, and you can see it all the time. I would say Angola has a civil war it had civil war for so long. Mozambique, Rwanda in Africa. So there are so many subversive forces, ethnic groups, which they feel that they have to get justice, so they define themselves as nation and fight. In different parts of the world, this is a problem. State subverting nationalism is a normal reality, but in Africa, they have another thing. They have African Union, which is a pan-African organization with 54 members, and they have planned to kind of integrate Africa by 2063. And they also want to have one market, one single market of Africa, because if Africa unites, it will be power to be reckoned with, and that's how Africans are working. I want to come to Asia. I want to make only one or two points concerning nationalism in Asia. To me, what strikes me most actually, perhaps Ram will bear me out differently, what strikes me most is to take, for example, migrants in Asia. Now, there are many Chinese migrants in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Southeast Asia. And consistently, they are providing revenue to China. And China is also investing in these areas. So there is something like diasporic nationalism, that they stay out there, they are playing a role for the country. Take India. India has also people in Southeast Asia, New Zealand, Australia. Migrants play a very major role, and they imagine India too. And shortly, we'll have Kamala Harris as Vice President of the United States. And there is Indian community in the United States, which is a major lobby, which is diasporic. They play a role in United States, but they also finance parties here. They also support Indian cause, and that works. So there is something like diasporic nationalism we cannot ignore. And when India's citizenship laws have also from 1955 to 2005. I don't want to get into details, but when Vajpayee was there, even dual citizenship was conceived, isn't it? So there is something citizenship nationality related, but there is diasporic nationalism. I want to give you one simple example, and that is, India when had a crisis in 1990, major economic crisis, exchange very badly, because there was a depletion in foreign exchange reserves. And you know who earns foreign exchange for us? There's a useless movie, I'm sorry, but I felt like that. But I enjoyed myself. Called Hum Aapke Hain Kaun? And that Hum Aapke Hain Kaun was seen all over the world. And it earned lot of foreign exchange to India. And subsequently, Dil Wale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, and so much foreign exchange was earned. So diaspora don't discount. Indian diaspora is there, and diasporic nationalism of Asian countries also is there. I'll make one more point, that what happens sometimes is because of demographic pressures, people move from one border to another. Nepalese come into India, settle. Bangladeshis come to India and settle. How does one handle that particular part is a question which all nation states face, because where to draw the boundary? Suppose somebody is helpless and he crosses the border, will you shoot that person, or will you kind of be congenial, kind, and try to see that he either repatriated or settled properly in this part? This is not sorted out because of the way nationality gets expressed, intense nationalist feeling get expressed. I will now come to my last segment, and that is imperialism, globalization, and nation states. I would like to say very simply, I have been consistently defining imperialism as asymmetric power relationship of interdependence between materially advanced and backward societies. Asymmetric power relationship of interdependence between materially advanced and backward societies. And you can see it all around. That United States was imperialist or has been imperialist, you don't require to say it. It was imperialist without colonies. It is indirect empire. Everybody has debated over it. China is today expansionist. Belt Road Initiative, China is also there to kind of make China into Middle Kingdom again somewhere. And more the power, more you try to do it. Americans tried to do it during Cold War and later. For example, in the 80s, they had allies in Marcos in Philippines, General Zia in Pakistan, Pinochet in Chile, Mobutu in Zaire, apartheid South Africa was the ally, Zionist Israel was the ally. They're trying to build kind of their own form of coalitions to counter Soviet Union. America has been hegemonic, and in a very Gramscian sense. In Gramscian sense, you become a hegemonic power when you combine coercion and consent. So somewhere people felt that America following it with an appeal will get something out of it. So they join you. If they don't, then you have coerce. Like in Chile, they topple the government. There are many ways America has run its empire. And Russia also was an empire, but it suffered what Paul Kennedy talked about, imperial overstage. That they spent so much on army in Afghanistan, in Hungary, in East Europe, in Ethiopia. They bought goods from their allies at much higher prices than world market like Ethiopia or Cuba, and they suffered. And eventually Russia failed because economically it failed miserably, although it was a military power. I would say that all the world under globalization went through 2008 meltdown because of financial excesses. But some countries did well, some countries did not do well. But point is, America, European countries still remain strong, so China as far as imperialism is concerned. France controls many African colonies even today in different forms. I would consider that South Africa also was protected as a sub-imperial state by America for a long time because apartheid suited South Africa, America. I would also like to say that China, for instance, whatever they are doing in Tibet or Xinjiang, it is imperial. And maybe kind of some other parties, Pakistan might call India imperial. It depends on how you define what is what, imperialist. But imperialist tendencies are ever there and we cannot get away from them. I would also say that, the idea of humanitarian intervention which became popular after the Cold War much more, has imperialist tendencies in it. America and NATO countries, without authorization from the United States, intervened in Yugoslavia in 1999. United States intervened in Afghanistan to bring peace. And United States also intervened in 2003 in Iraq, even though France and Russia were not supporting it in the Security Council. So, it is always possible that this goes on. France also, I mean, it's imperial policies in Africa, I can give lecture on it very differently. Point to be kind of noted is that among interstate relations, because there is asymmetry of relation and there is vertical link between dominant and dependent countries, imperialism is always a possibility. So within any region also, India can be dominant in South Asia, Nigeria can be dominant in West Africa, Iran can be dominant in the Gulf, South Africa can be dominant in Southern Africa, Brazil can be dominant in Latin America, and top countries like America or China are now trying to have haywire. China tries to dominate Asia Pacific. It has presence in Asia Pacific. It has presence in Indian Ocean with a base in Djibouti. So, imperialism and nation states, there is a logic between the two. They merge, mingle in globalization. India also has struck alliances with Australia, Japan, United States to counter China at Malacca Strait and other parts. So, imperialism is a very major reality, and dominant-dependent relations cannot be avoided. I think, I would say there is something like dialectics between nation states and globalization, and then it has assumed several forms all along. Sometimes we feel that nation states are getting deterritorialized, but again we feel they are getting reterritorialized. There is also formation of regional organizations, support to universal organizations like United States. Sometimes there is a rise of secessionist forces which subvert nations from within. So they're dominant from above, dependent from, subverted from below. Nation state is enjoying some kind of peculiar existential strain under globalization, and new nationalities are coming up. Separate nationalities are asking and crying for nation states. And when you look at all this, I would say, I'll sum up by saying few things. That is still, world has many challenges, and nation state has to be agency to sort out those challenges. You can't ignore nation state. For instance, climate change. It's a major challenge before the world politics today and economy and also society. Ecological destruction, relationship in first and the third world. And all this can be sorted out only when nation states decide to work together, because that's a primary actor in international politics, primary agency and catalytic which can sort it out. You have something like nuclear proliferation. Nations only have bombs. Maybe terrorists also have acquired it now, I can't say. There is also something like, Chernobyl incident, or in Japan, Fukushima incident. You have to stop this proliferation. You have done something like race for technological hegemony. Internet, for example, is a universal reality, and it remained universal for so long. But now China is extending its jurisdiction as a state to control what comes from internet. And so there is a clash. It has been brought out well by Samir Amin and Samir Saran and Shashi Tharoor. Interesting, and different laws being passed, but how again nation state intervenes. It's not such a useless reality. It's resilient. It takes the strains and rises up. I would also like to say here that we have many calamities like tsunami, HIV, AIDS, pandemic like corona. Unless nations and states and societies cooperate under globalization, how it can be sorted out? You have terrorist outfits growing all over. Unless coalition of nation states works, how can it be sorted out? And there is also talk of global civil society, but to establish a global civil society, states have to also cooperate, otherwise it will not come, because you have to give visas, you have to make people free, the movement free, and these are the things. So if you look at it, globalization may involve many complex, multi-layered processes which make us think as one unit. Nation states kind of restricts us. State and nation are different, but they are there. And there is something like, world today which has transnational actors as well as subnational actors coming on the center stage, and still nation state is surviving to struggle. Still, it is a very major agent of the globalization. Still, coalitions and cooperation are stuck because nation state exists as a unit by law. And still, United Nations functions with more than 190 nations because they exist by law. We talk of democratization of United Nations, admission to India, South Africa, or Brazil, or any emerging country. So this is the dialectics of relationship between nation state and globalization. In substance, then, I talked to you about globalization, its relationship with capitalism, its relationship with nation states. Then we examined West Europe, East Europe, Africa, Asia, and then we also examined imperialism and globalization and capitalism. All this together, I think, sums up my talk. And I must thank you ever so much for listening to me so very patiently. And thanks everybody who came, because it was a great occasion personally for me. Moving. Arvinda, I can see. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for that enlightening lecture. We have learned so much from you today. And there are some people who was also saying in the comment section that people who didn't know globalization also understood globalization thanks to your lecture. Thank you once again, sir.
Thank you so much.
I felt as if I was transported back to my MA class and your class on world affairs. It was so good. And it was said in such a simple style and language that even people who are not political scientists were able to understand and appreciate it. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. And have a good Sunday.
Thank you, sir. There are a few questions that our participants would like to ask, sir.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the first question is by Murari Prasad. He wants to know, what is your take on globalization, that is global plus local, vis-a-vis globalization in the context of a post-colonial society like India?
That is the byproduct of this. There is something like local emerging. Many times such slogans come up, think locally, act globally. That is there. And when there is Professor Ramesh Babu has written a book on localization only. So that's a reality.
Okay, sir. And then Pradipta Kumar Panda wants to know, do you think the slogan of think global, act local will enable the status quo of the third world countries?
They think it doesn't lead to status quo. These are all slogans. Actually, more power you capture, more you will expand in international politics. And that's a kind of crude reality. China is today threatening everybody because it has power. It is local, global, everything. People have nothing to show. International politics at a very crude level is power politics. And so, unless it has those basic elements of power, like United States, why do we call it powerful? Because it is powerful in security-related complexes, it is powerful in technology, finances, and also it has powerful knowledge-producing apparatuses. Why so many people want to go to Harvard, Yale? Why don't they go to JNU and Hyderabad? Because somewhere there are better branded universities. You have many bright people. India is full of bright economists. Well, it's not that, but the point is American power is behind. No? And I can tell you one thing, that how when I was a student in Europe, how we were treated in Paris in 73, and when I began to teach abroad, how different it was, because India had already gone through information revolution, and they began to look at us with some respect. And it will be much more so. You have to kind of make your institution stronger, your democracy stronger, and you will become a great country. So it's not local or anything, it's a kind of effort. Somewhere America achieves that power, or Germany achieves that power. Germany has completely destroyed nation, how they came up. Japan was destroyed, how they came up. Where is the land and how does one achieve it? And what is it that one needs to do? That's a question.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. The third question is by Dr. K.V. Surendaran. He wants to know, well, don't you think that communist parties in state of India, when they are in power, are also following the capitalist policies?
It is inevitable. No? Jyoti company, they went for a kind of to seek investments in Europe and Southeast Asia. They started reforms, and Narasimha Rao gathered consensus on reforms across the party spectrum. For rhetoric, they may oppose capitalism, but they can't. Where is the alternative? And there is nothing good or bad about system. I think when we were college students, somebody made profit, we used to feel, how can he make profit? There is nothing bad or good about the system. It's a question of regulation. It's a question of distributive justice, not all this.
True, sir. True, sir.
Communist countries are more unequal in my view. I have gone to Russia also. See, unequal in the sense, there is inequality in terms of power. And if suppose some Stalin takes over, it's impossible to live in such country. And they suffered that for so many years. India is also kind of happy because we can talk whatever we want to here in this country. There is freedom. Less perhaps, but yes, freedom is there. And it should be so.
Thank you, sir. I think you are right when you say you cannot have a right or wrong. It is what will work and what can be regulated.
No, I'll tell you more importantly, what we require, this is my long experience. I used to be ideological also once upon a time in my life. I think we require men and women with integrity. And people who are people with integrity who reduce gap between what they say and what they do. If such people are there in different parts, in universities, in any other part, I think we will do very well. Whether socialism or capitalism, it will succeed only when we have individual material which is good. Otherwise, how will you succeed? We talk about competing with the world universities, world ranking, this, that. Our consistent policy in this country is to we are cruel to competence, this is our policy. Now, how can we do well? We are cruel to competence in universities, that's a fact. Anybody who is working very hard, he feels out of place. This is our university. Anywhere in the public sector, you see how people don't work. And if you tell them that more and more people, less and less work and no accountability, people will call you anti-people. What are you talking? Discipline ourselves. How do we come up? By only begging from the state that give me more pension, give me LTC, give me something. But give something to this. Otherwise, how will it become whatever you want to?
True, sir. True, sir.
Stand up and say, this is what I want to give to my community, society. There's a wonderful book by Raghuram Rajan, Market, State and Community. Interesting book, actually. So there are people, and also justice, also notion of justice. So Ram will tell you more, and many other friends. Like after Rawls, Amartya Sen wrote something more imaginative on justice itself.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Murari Prasad wants to know that going by your observations germane to the entities like nation state, is India a nation state or a multinational state?
I call it multinational state. And I confess, if I'm exposing my nationality, but I can tell you one thing, a good deal of Maratha history I studied with some depth, and Maharashtra became a nation much before many parts of the country. And that's a nationality which sustained them. They also built themselves up on the basis of some form of sacrifice. They lost many lives, they lost many wars. And that kind of nationality and those kinds of reforms, one has to study why particularly. I am not being chauvinist at all. I have been critical of Maharashtrians much more than any others, but try and see. You have Ambedkar, Phule, and also range of reforms coming only from one area. You have Shivaji to Bajirao to others range. So it's a nation. But constitutionally it's a state of the Indian Union. Bengal is a nation. And see, the way Tagore's poems excite Bengalis is like nationality. And the way Bengalis behave with each other when they meet. And the way Tamilians have that. So there are many nationalities actually, but we are under one political state. But it's also somewhere we could think of civilization. That is much larger. Civilization can absorb many nationalities. Civilization can even absorb erstwhile empires. Civilization can absorb kingdoms and principalities. And civilization can absorb diversities. If you play with our diversity, like Trump tried to play with the diversity of the United States, it will take time for them to repair what has happened to them. We cannot do it. This is like this, India. What is India? To me, I think, how in a bunch of flowers have different kinds of roses, rose, jasmine, so many roses come together. That's how India has Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, Christians, Buddhists, so many kinds of faiths. That is one part of India, I feel. So like Beethoven symphony, all the tunes are not in tune. There is nothing like a symphony. So I personally feel India is inherently democratic. Western people don't have to teach democracy to Indians. Because every time it has revolted against anything that is oppressive. And right from rise of Buddha to rise of Bhakti sense, there is something like dissent which is normal in India. See, nobody can control this country. It's very anarchic and nothing can happen easily. People feel for some time they can control press, they can control media. Nothing will happen. We have seen them how they fell by the wayside.
Oh, sir, we are a bouquet. of flowers. I think that was a very nice analogy, and also the symphony. Thank you, sir. The second part of his question was, how is a nation different from transnation?
When you cross the nationality and state and strike something, like transnational firm works in more than one nation state, that is transnation. It's not trans of metaphysical kind, it's a physical trans.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, sir, for that. UC Srivastav Prayagraj wants to know if capitalism is bad for the environment. I think he means the international environment.
No, I'll tell you what happens is, for a long time, and he's one of the greatest zoologists from this country, Professor Srivastav. And it is what has happened is, when enlightenment phase took place in Europe, and science and reason got undue important, somewhere they became expansionists. They also destroyed the environment by colonizing people. The way Africa is desertified, the way jungles are cut, it has happened because of capitalism and imperialism were interlinked. So capitalism has done damage to imperialism. There is no doubt about it. But Western countries don't want to kind of pay for it. Like they could kind of give some aid to developing countries to see that they face climate change. That also is not happening. So capitalism as a system has to change. It has to kind of have human face, and it can have human face. Because I can tell you one thing, I'm forgetting the name of that Jew magnate. He wrote an article called Capitalist Threat. He's a kind of financer. And he said that after the fall of Soviet Union, capitalism, which is in unbridled form, is causing exploitation of classes and inequalities. I'm forgetting the name of he's Jewish, and he has a foundation after Karl Popper. He's a positivist, forgetting the name. But yes, capitalists also have criticized capitalism. It's not so. Capitalism has survived all this far because there is inner criticism. And that is important. That they've grown from their losses, their defeats, and swung back because they're resilient. They're resilient.
Yes, thank you so for that. Arvinda Dahiya wants to know, he wants to first congratulate you on this insightful lecture. He wants to know, given that globalization means access to information and resources, how do you see this impacting national level and state level responses to globalization?
They will change, as Arvinda is one of my very brilliant students, actually. And it is pleasure that she is here. There is asymmetry of information when information flows, and there is now new kind of research going on economics of information itself and politics of information. So I think that all information, in spite of it, does not reach you. And some are less privileged because they have less information, less access, and they are not able to get the fighting chance. Like, for example, in Allahabad, when we were there, power supply was not always constant. But in Bihar, there can be no power supply for 2-3 days. How can you think of online classes? How can you think of getting information immediately? So these are the information asymmetries created by conditions. And then different states, according to their level of development, would respond differently. Different nations will respond differently. And emerging economies like India, Brazil, South Africa, they will respond differently. Weaker countries like Zambia, Nepal, there is no question of an unevenness in this, because there is uneven flow of information. Globalization is uneven. That's a process. It's not complete. It's in the process. So it's not complete. It has struck peripheries. It has not struck entirely interior. Many such things are all. Like capitalism is not everywhere. We have capitalist formation and pre-capitalist formation simultaneously existing in India. So globalization is somewhere reflection of capitalism, also imperialism also, and we can't deny it.
True, sir. Thank you for that, sir. Murari Prasad wants to know, how can we distinguish between diasporic shifts and dispersions from transnation?
Actually, I will tell you what, it will not be fair on my part to answer this question, because I have not done sufficient research on diaspora. And you have also diaspora in Mauritius, and so much of your black money gets kind of white through Mauritius. Diaspora plays different kinds of roles. No? I have not done sufficient research to talk on this.
Okay, sir. Anuradha Ramanan wants to know what is the impact of globalization on the principle of sovereignty of states?
I think sovereignty is consistently getting challenged. There is no question about it. But what happens is, if ingredients of sovereignty are lost, nation state also is trying to survive, and it has tremendous survival abilities, and that's why it is hitting back all the time. I feel as if it is we should write obituary of nation states, but it strikes back and comes in a form which is more virulent, and it is happening all the time.
Yes, sir.
Northeast of India, why we are not able to handle Northeast? But there is a kind of sub-national entity which is coming up. I remember going to Northeast, and so many times people are saying that we don't feel part of India. Then very simple question I asked, is there corruption in Northeast, in your part, Mizoram and Nagaland? They said corruption is very much there. I said, then you are part of India. What is that? It's integral. You are integrated.
Thank you, sir. Akash Bhati wants to know, we know everyone is in some way or the other linked to capitalism, yet many of the people say it's the biggest evil and should be countered. Is it possible to dodge capitalism in today's world?
No, you have to build capitalism with human face. I'll tell you what, if you read Nehru closely, don't go by what people say on Nehru today. Just forget WhatsApp University and this and that. Pick up one book by R.K. Karanjia, and that book's title is Philosophy of Nehru. And there is one question Nehru has tried to answer, and that is a very simple question. Can socialized capitalism coexist with liberalized communism? Can socialized capitalism coexist with liberalized communism? And that is what he tried to struggle to build in India. So capitalism has to be socialized, communism has to be liberalized. Otherwise, extremes won't work. Somewhere realities are grey and we have to face them. All Euro-communist movement, Fabianism, they also tried to see both.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Dr. Padma Lochan Raut wants to know, how is globalization and liberalization related to each other?
I think, allegedly, globalization allowed free flow of everything, and it liberalized economies through, for example, there was no such movement of finance the way it was, and currency movement and currency markets, or no such movements of investments. And that free flow of money, investment, trade, that is also the impact of liberalization. Many people call it neoliberal. And neoliberal is a specific term which was used in Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher's time, when they're trying to roll back the state to see market has its role to play. But everywhere people use neoliberal. India is not neoliberal. It is not neoliberal. Why do they use it? I don't understand. I'd be very happy if somebody tells me. But one of my friends has written a book on this area, how neocons and neoliberals thought about neoliberalism. And I'll just give you quickly something, that in the 30s, early 30s, many liberals in Europe, primarily Jews also, they hated Hitler and Stalin both. They migrated to United States. They could not get admission in best schools like Harvard. They had to study in City University of New York. That is where they established the coffee club. Then they got together and they said, we will never have Hitler or Stalin in this world. And then they began to think that America can be a messenger of freedom and establish freedom all over the world. And that is how they began to work. And some of them became neoconservative, some of them became neoliberal. They captured the corridors of power. I brought it out in one of my articles in Economic and Political Weekly. So once they captured power, they kind of talked of liberalism, Washington consensus, to make world more free. And they also began to levy conditions, like African countries, if they want loans, let them hold elections, even if they're rigged, elections, democracy. So free world, human rights, that was the part of neoliberal agenda. There's much to talk about it, but India, I don't know why they use it. India, I tell you what, it's a kind of country where state is still the largest employer. It's the largest employer. And we don't see any kind of capitalist trends anywhere of those kinds. Because first world and post-industrial world and this world are different systems.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Padma Lochan wants to know the impact of capitalism on democratic economy.
I think it's a very broad question, but actually something very interesting, that liberalism and democracy and capitalism, they have gone hand in hand. And look, you have Britain, France, United States, these are all living examples of this. Living examples of this. And democracy and capitalism as a combination has always worked. But even Nazis were backed by capitalists, and biggest dictators in Africa were backed by capitalists. So capitalism can take many forms. It's not necessarily democracy. Authoritarian regime of South Korea was capitalist. Thailand was capitalist. How can capitalism be separated from it? Today, capitalism is assuming many forms of government. All over the world is capitalist today. Even if you say, perhaps Cuba is a solitary exception, so they think and so we think. But democracy and capitalism go hand in hand if the rulers are liberal. Can't hear.
Yes, sir.
Any other question?
Yes, sir. Bholanath Haldar wants to know if you can suggest a good book on this topic.
There are a range of books actually and articles. I can't offhand suggest, but I had written a book once upon a time called Interpreting Globalization. It came out many years ago. Some of these issues which are raised, they are there. And then there are books like,
Okay.
plenty, but he'll get bored reading them. Technical books. David Held has written a very good book on globalization again, from the Western perspective. Kaldor has written a good book again, very good book. Or Stiglitz has written a good book on globalization. Jagdish Bhargavati has written a good book on globalization and discontent, in defense of globalization. This is a very good book, Jagdish Bhargavati and Joseph Stiglitz. If you read two books, you will realize two perspectives how they are. And Making Globalization Work by Stiglitz, that's also a very good book.
Okay, sir. I think the another book is by the World Flat. That was also very interesting with that Stiglitz had come out. Sir, Pradipta Kumar Panda wants to know, should we call globalization a form of neo-capitalism?
Why call it neo-capital? It's a kind of, it's capitalism only, what else? All capitalist features thrive and imperialism is integral to it. It's a one more stage in the development of capitalism at one level. But I said in the beginning, I will not reduce it to capitalism alone. At the same time, I would like to say one interesting thing, when you want to run a market, you have to work very hard to see how it works. That's why Ram will tell us, economists, as the science has grown, and neoclassical economics, or anything that happened in economy, because they were running something. It's very difficult to run something. If you want to oppose something like capitalism, umpteen number of things can be said, and they don't want to run anything. All other left parties have always been irresponsible in India, because they're against something. But if you give them chance, they'll make a mess of it. That's how their history has been. Whether Lohia JP or whether Jyoti Basu, they will make a mess for sure. Opposing, it's all right. Every day some strike, something. You should give me my rights. What will you give in turn? Do they talk about duties? No. So it's very strange, but that's how it is.
Dr. Padlochan wants to know how globalization influences world literature.
What? Globalization.
How globalization
No.
influences world literature.
Now all these realities will reflect, like kinds of transnational alliances which are coming up among the, like for example, race. Race is a very major issue in world politics today. Very, very major issue. And race is a constructed reality. Somewhere the blacks are made to feel inferior. They were treated as slaves. No human being was treated so badly as blacks were or Afro-Americans were. But today a race is constructed in a manner when it is a power relationship. And that power relationship of race, whether it's in America, Africa, or other parts, has brought out so many interesting poems, so many interesting kind of literary kind of ideas. If you read Chinua Achebe, or there's a poem by two Africans who are working in the Johannesburg and his gold mines. And both of them are old, they're going down the mine. And one says, what are you looking at? It's a diamond mine. What are you looking at? So he says, I'm looking at where my youth and health went away. My youth and health. They says, why are you worried? Your health and youth is sitting on the necklace of one damsel in Paris who is enjoying the diamond necklace. That's how your youth was wasted. And all these ideas come because it's a creative way of looking at it. Race has become so important problem in world politics, but we have not explored it properly. And globalization has actually exacerbated race-related tensions. And America is now a symbol of it. Look at the way it is happening. That we talk of Black Lives Matter. Some time ago we talked of black is beautiful. Why it is happening? Because in a globalized world, gave you the kind of chance to construct race for 200 years where some races are made to feel inferior all over the world. It is also true about the browns and yellows. So it always will influence. And then I concentrated on period post 1991. Globalization predates that. And there are many people who have worked before that period also. No? I wanted to be within my focus.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I think with that, we end the question answer session. Many people are thanking you personally, sir, on the chat box. I think if you have the time, you should go through it because people are really thanking you for such good answers and the presentation as well. So now with this, we end the session of question answers. And now I invite Vivek, Assistant Professor, School of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, Auro University, Surat, to give us the vote of thanks. Over to you, Vivek.
Thank you, Ariba. Good afternoon, sir. It was a really great pleasure listening to you again after so many days and getting back those memories of class, attending your classes. It is my pleasure to also read out the vote of thanks for this particular lecture today. Professor, I would like to start off by thanking Professor Rajan Harshe on breaking down the idea of globalization, changing role of the nation state, the various ways in which capitalism has its capacity to shift from crisis to crisis, its ability to function under a variety of different political contexts, and how it continues to sort of influence the spread of globalization as well as be influenced by globalization through different forms, including uneven development, breaking of borders, and a number of other processes in the global political economy and socio-cultural spheres. So I think his talk also conveyed a lot of details on a very broad canvas. And a sort of key point, which I thought we should all probably consider, is what he mentioned about how the nation and the state are both at heart sort of violent endeavors. So what could be possible alternatives to bring society together? What sort of community-based alliances could be developed to help us face challenges like climate change, nuclear proliferation, defense issues, and even different forms of racism, economic inequalities, spread of diseases, and terror groups. I would also, at this point of time, like to thank the president of the Association of Indian Research Scholars, Ariba Hasnath, for conceptualizing, realizing, and bringing to sort of fruition of this particular lecture today. And also to add thanks again to Professor Harshay for taking the time out of his busy schedule to join us and give us this very enlightening lecture. I thank also the members who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible. Special mentions, of course, to Ziba Tamkanat, Narendra Kumar Jarwal, Mohammad Farisuddin, Salma Jahan, and Evangeline Knocklaw. We at AIRS are grateful for the support, enthusiasm, and determination of the speaker, the participants, and especially the team at AIRS, especially under the support and guidance of the president, Ariba Hasnath Mozam. And thank you to all of you for making this lecture this afternoon. Have a great Sunday ahead, and we will continue with the conversations on AIRS. Over to Ariba.
Thank you, Vivek, for succinctly giving us the vote of thanks. I want to once again thank all of you. And with this, I call the event to an end. Have a great day ahead. And I hope to see all of you in our next lecture on November 15th by our first Young Research E-lecture by Aratrika Ganguly on Coolies in Indian Literature, Understanding Colonial History and Modern Slavery. Au revoir and have a great Sunday ahead.
Thank you very much. I was forgetting the name of George Soros. George Soros.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lovely lecture. It was wonderful listening to you.
I also enjoyed being with all of you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'd like to say hi to Shanta Sinha ma'am.
Hello, Shanta.
Where's Shanta ma'am?
I'm here. Hi. It was lovely listening to you and lovely having all the old students in this group coming. Great nostalgia. Best wishes to you.
Shanta ma'am.
Hi, Alvila. Hi.
Shanta ma'am, good morning, and so nice to see you and sir again.
I know. This is
Very nice.
lovely. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it.
Lovely to see you, Anuradha. Very
Same,
nice.
sir, and I love the passion that you still have for the topic and everything. So wonderful to listen to you.
Same kindness, no?
It hasn't changed a bit.
Absolutely. Thank God for that.
No,
We need
nothing
people
changed.
like that.
He hasn't changed
That's
one
true.
bit also. He's just
And
the same, okay?
Yeah, I enjoyed the punches he gave in between, some sarcasm, some fun. He could resist himself. That was nice, very nice.
Thank
Lovely.
you. Thank you so much.
Lovely for organizing this.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Ariba. Thank you so much.
Yeah, very nice.
Thanks
And
all.
stay safe and secure. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. We will.
Nice to see Anuradha. I mean, I see her on her Facebook
Very nice to see
sometimes. It's nice. To see you all.
See you all soon.
See you, ma'am, in fact, after a long time.
Bye-bye.
Right. Okay. Have a nice day, all of you.
Have a nice day. Bye, Ariba.
Bye, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. My pleasure.